And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Preterist Apologetics here on Two Guys in a Bible. Sorry about that.
Well, we are two guys and we've got a
We
Bible.
are two guys, and we do have a Bible. Look, I
Don,
apologize.
Don does so many shows. He's
This is my
trying to keep
third
track.
one. This is my third one in 2 days.
Oh, there you
Uh,
have it.
yeah, Zach and I had a really super good show yesterday afternoon at 1:30,
Yeah, I
and
saw most of that. That was good. On
and
second on
then at
2 Corinthians 3, right?
yeah, and then at 7 o'clock last night, uh, I had gotten an invitation. There's a guy out of Ontario, Canada. He actually has a worldwide broadcast.
Hmm.
Um, and I've been on his program. Oh, gee, couldn't even tell you how many times. He, uh, he delves into a lot of stuff that I'm not into, black helicopters and that kind of stuff. But he also gets into some really good philosophical and even religious kind of stuff. And I don't know whether it's just hype or whatever it is, but he seems to have taken a liking to me. And so I contacted him yesterday morning and I said, by the way, haven't been on your show in like 2 years now, but I said, I'll be having a debate with a world famous atheist a week from Saturday. I don't know if you've got a spot for me or not, but what about it? Boy, I mean, in 2 minutes, I had a response. He said, here's a calendar, pick a time. Well, none of the times worked. And so I got back with him. And he said, how about tonight? Let's do it tonight. Okay. So we had a really, really good show.
Good.
So
Excellent.
yeah, I'm what day is it? So what show
Right,
is this on?
right.
And folks, uh, you'll notice my view here is darker than normal. I was sharing with Mike before airtime that, of course, my debate with Richard Carrier is a week from Saturday and a week from tomorrow. And normally, my lighting, which is a strip light up here with four bulbs, most of you have probably noticed I have a great big bright shiny spot on my forehead. I've been trying to overcome that today by taking bulbs out. I've got a lamp on my desk right here to try to diffuse a little bit and what have you. I just haven't found a really good lighting system. So I'm still working on it. I may have to get my wife to put some powder on my forehead to keep it from glaring during the show. But other than that, if I can't get it done, big deal.
Yeah.
I've been doing this kind of show for how many years now, and people haven't complained about my glowing head. So we'll see what happens. So anyway, yeah, this is preterist apologetics.
Hey, that sounds familiar.
That
Yeah.
sounds familiar. That's Mike Sullivan. I'm Don Preston. We're glad that you are with us, and we are glad to be with you again to continue our study. I tell you, boy, it's a good study of the
Mm.
Song of Moses and its impact on the entirety of biblical eschatology. And Mike, I just got to say a word here. Today, I was going back over some of the notes from Dr. Carrier that he had sent to me in email correspondence. And I mean, when I have read that, and I've read these comments probably no less than 10 times, and every single time that I've read his comments, I'm just literally shaking my head, going, he literally doesn't have a clue about biblical theology. I
Mm.
mean, no disrespect whatsoever. He's a brilliant scholar from the world's perspective, but there's a huge difference between being a historian and being a theologian.
Mhm.
And he's a historian, a skeptical, negative historian. And he literally does not have any idea of the beauty, the harmony, and the unity of the biblical narrative. Not a clue in the world. And here's what I mean. The Old Testament prophets, they said things like, well, the sun will be dark and the moon not give its light, the stars of heaven would be shaken, the powers of the heaven would be shaken, et cetera, et cetera. And commenting on Isaiah chapter 13, he said, Isaiah wasn't looking for any catastrophic end of the world. He was poetically speaking about the impending judgment of Babylon by the Medes. And I'm going,
This is what Carrier says?
this is what Carrier says. And I'm going,
Wow. Okay.
okay, yeah. And on Isaiah 24, actually 23 through 27, he makes the same kind of comments.
Well, you've got him right where you want him now. I mean, it's over before it's begun,
Well,
really.
here's where he pivots, though, and this is the inconsistency. And that is, so he comes to Jesus's language in Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31, 30 and following especially. The moon shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, the stars of heaven will be shaken, the powers of the heaven will be shaken. And he takes that absolutely literally.
Just like a futurist. Yeah.
Yeah, just like a typical futurist. So the great hermeneutical question is, if you acknowledge the poetic metaphoric nature of this identical language in the Tanakh, what's your hermeneutic for saying, oh, well, Jesus was using it literally?
Well, so what we have here is we have a liberal skeptic who's going to go to the Old Testament and understand that the language was apocalyptic and spiritual, metaphoric, and even probably the time statements were literal. But
Yes.
once we get to Jesus and the New Testament authors, he abandons the Old Testament hermeneutic of apocalyptic symbolic language, but then stays with the literal time statements being literal so that he can produce his bias that the New Testament authors are a failure. Jesus is a false prophet. He couldn't be God. The scriptures can't be inspired. Therefore, let's move on.
That's precisely his hermeneutic.
Yeah. So
I mean, in a nutshell,
he's cherry picking is what he's doing
in a massive way. I mean, when I went through, like I said, I've read his comments no less than 10 times, going, okay, does he not see his inherent self contradictions here? I mean, how can you write something like that and then come to the New Testament? And when I asked him, well, in Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31, was Jesus predicting an end of time conflagration? And he said, yes. How do we know that? Because that's what he said.
But when Isaiah says it, it's not really what he said.
It's not really what he meant.
Wow.
So yeah, this is really interesting. And, you know, I have no earthly idea if he might be watching tonight, and it really doesn't matter to me because this is his hermeneutic. So he's going to have to explain that.
Yeah, he is.
And justify that in our debate. Where
now remember your debate with the first atheist guy who refused to go to the Old Testament because he saw the train coming.
Yes.
Okay. Now Richard has already given up ground there. And so that train is coming really hard. It's going to be really hard at him.
Yes, indeed. But here's what he does. Okay. Here's what he does. This is absolutely amazing. He says, okay, these passages, Isaiah 13, Isaiah 23 through 27, etc., are using poetic language. They were not expecting the end of time space continuum. But in the New Testament and in the first century, the Jews, including the Essenes, they took those Old Testament prophecies, reworked them, and applied them to the end of the world. So he's blaming the first century Jews for literalizing it. Well, I'm going, yes, they did, and they were wrong.
And Jesus confronts them just about everywhere in the Gospels.
Everywhere in the Gospels, Jesus rejected the traditional, widespread Jewish beliefs.
And again, I always go back to with the skeptic Robert Price that I've been interacting with in the past. He tried to pull that, and he goes, "Well, you preterist, you guys are just trying to salvage the failure of the New Testament by applying everything spiritual." And I said, no. I said, what I'm doing, Mr. Price, and you have not refuted, is that I'm proving from the Old Testament itself, Daniel chapter 2, that Jesus is exegeting that spiritual kingdom without hands. And he's exegeting that. And the New Testament follows it. So I'm not making anything up. I'm simply following Daniel 2, and I'm following Jesus's teaching. The burden of proof is upon you to prove that they were mistaken in teaching a spiritual kingdom. And of course, I didn't hear from him after that. But
Well, I'm not surprised at all. Shock and disbelief.
yeah,
Well, and that's precisely what goes on with so many of them. And this is where Dr. Carrier does this identical thing. He shifts and he says that, to reiterate, all of the Essenes, the Jews of Jesus's day, they took those Old Testament poetic texts and they applied them literally. That was the widespread Jewish belief, and that's precisely what Jesus believed in. Well, look, that's not a new position, obviously. I mean, Albert Schweitzer took the position that Jesus expected a literal nationalistic kingdom, and Dr. or not Dr., but Elton Holland, with whom I've been interacting, great guy, on full preterism. He wrote a critique, and I've written a response, and all that's on my website. He talks about, and by the way, he appeals to Dale Ellison Jr., with whom I've had the pleasure of corresponding.
yeah,
And Dale Ellison Jr. says, well, what we have is Jesus shared the common expectation of the Jews of his day. Paul did as well. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Jesus stood out, distinctive, totally, radically different from his contemporaries. You got all these would-be messiahs running around the countryside. Acts chapter 5, Judas, Theudas, neither one of which had any success. They all wound up getting killed. You had the group that went up to Mount Gerizim in Samaria, and they were slain. I believe Pilate actually killed them, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wrong on that detail. But nonetheless, you had all of these would-be messiahs running around the Judean Israelite territory, the zealots slipping in the crowd, killing people, trying to, work up zeal against the Romans so that they could go to war. And you don't find anything like that in Jesus. You find just the opposite. So how these scholars, and there was one scholar by the name of Bo Reike, a very prominent scholar. He took the position that Jesus was, in fact, a revolutionary. He was a zealot himself. That's why he chose Simon the Zealot.
Boy, yeah. Let's just read everything in the New Testament that's not there.
Yeah.
Well, folks, what we're really talking about here is Deuteronomy 32. Let me read it, 28 and 29. For they are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. If they were wise, but most of them would not be, they would understand this. They would discern their latter end, but they didn't. It was prophesied 2,000 years before AD 70 that they would not understand what would take place in their latter end, in their last days, because they wanted a physical kingdom. They would reject the rock, they would reject their Messiah and his teaching on the kingdom, and they wanted a nationalistic kingdom just like all the other kingdoms. They wanted to restore their former glory of the old covenant kingdom. And God said, no, I'm going to do a new thing in Isaiah. And only the remnant is going to have the understanding, because I'm going to open their hearts and I'm going to give them understanding. The rest are going to be hardened. And it's through that hardening process and through the remnant and the ingrafting of the Gentiles that all Israel, the remnant and the believing Gentiles, would be saved and come to her maturity. And we have these skeptics that don't understand that it's prophesied that the majority of the Jews wouldn't understand, and that Messiah would come and he would give the understanding through his parables, and no one could come to me unless the Father draw him. I mean, it was really specific that most of Israel would not understand what was going to take place in their last days.
Paul's doctrine of the remnant is one of his dominant themes, as you well know. I mean, we have the dispensationalists, even post-millennialists in our world saying, well, at some point of time, the great majority, not every single individual Jew, but the great bulk, the great body of Israel will be saved. That's flat contrary to everything, starting in the Tanakh all the way up through Paul. God never, ever, ever promised to save the majority. It was always the righteous remnant.
Amen.
Except the Lord give us a remnant, we should be like Sodom. We should be like Gomorrah, Isaiah chapter 10, 20 and following. And there are two corollary thoughts here that go directly back to Deuteronomy chapter 32 that you read for us there in verses 18 to 21, I think it was. Oh, that they were wise. Oh, that they would understand. Well, we already know that Jesus said in Matthew 17:17, this generation, they're not paying attention. That's a rough paraphrase, obviously. This isn't unbelieving. But notice what he did on two other occasions, Mike, and I know you're familiar with them. In Matthew chapter 12, you are able to discern the weather. If the sky is red or if the sky is lowering, you discern the times and the seasons. The weather, you're able to tell. You know what's going to happen. Luke chapter 19, as he approaches the city on that occasion. How is it that you do not know the time of your visitation? He castigated them for not knowing what time it was. That's a direct echo, Deuteronomy chapter 32.
Yeah.
Telling the Jews, look, folks, this was predicted a long time ago. The signs are all around you if you just open your eyes. And yet, of course, then we have what's known in the scholarly circles as a messianic secret. Well, that goes to the purpose of the parables. Jesus was asked by his apostles when he told the parables, why is it that you speak in the parables and not plainly? He said, well, to you it is given to understand the mysteries of the kingdom of God, but to them it is not given. And that's when he said, for one of the first times that he did, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them.
And he's quoting Isaiah there.
He is quoting Isaiah chapter 6. Yeah. This theme of Israel's blindness, and I've taken note of this before, of how N.T. Wright has some really, really fantastic comments about the consistent theme of Israel's blindness. You find it in Isaiah chapter 1, you find it chapter 6, you find it chapter 28, 29, you find it Psalm 69, Isaiah 59. You just find this theme of Israel's blindness throughout the prophetic scriptures. And as N.T. Wright points out, anytime you see Yahweh accusing Israel of blindness, the unfortunate reality is that judgment was not far off. Judgment was imminent. And it's really strange to me, Mike. It's just another example, however, of scholars saying really, really great, wonderful, and true things and not seeing the train coming of their own comments. Commenting on Romans chapter 11, 25, brethren, I would not have you to be ignorant of this mystery, how blindness in part has happened unto Israel. And so here's N.T. Wright saying, we would really like to think that at the end of the blindness, Israel would be converted and things would be great and blah, blah, blah. But he said, that's not the theme of blindness. When you see Israel's blindness and God accusing them of blindness throughout the scriptures, judgment is at hand. And he doesn't chase that thread. He just doesn't chase it and say the natural imminent judgment that was about to fall on Israel as a result of that blindness that he has quoted about from Deuteronomy 32, 19 to 21, that he has quoted about from Psalm 69. Paul is emphasizing Israel's blindness.
Which is interesting because N.T. Wright does develop AD 70 quite a bit in his writing. So you would
in the Gospels.
Yeah, you would think that he would follow that through, but obviously he sees the train coming too.
Yeah, he couldn't follow that in Romans chapter 11. Here's the reason why. Instead of following that chain that he himself put the links together, like I said, he appeals to Deuteronomy 32, blindness, people, the unbelief. Okay. He appeals to Psalms 69, which is just an incredible text that condemns Israel for their blindness.
Yeah, laying the trap at Passover for him.
That's exactly right. So he develops that and points out that Israel's blindness invariably pointed to imminent judgment. Then he drops it and he says, well, any time today that a Jew turns to Christ, that is resurrection, and that is part of the process of all Israel being saved.
No, well, it's when Messiah comes out of Zion or to Zion, either way. That is when.
That is that salvation would come.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But again, he stopped short on number one, he posits judgment, imminent judgment for blindness. And then he sets that completely in the background as if he hadn't said a word about it, and says, oh, all Israel will be saved when one Jew after another individually throughout time comes to Christ. That's a little bit of salvation. That's a little bit of resurrection, according to N.T. Wright.
That's your basic all-millennial position, though.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. That was the position I was raised on.
Yeah. Well, Don, I think in the last show we were going through the appointed time kairos as Paul develops it, because in the Septuagint of Deuteronomy 32:35, it is when the appointed time comes is when Israel's end would be near and all these things would be near. God would come in vengeance to avenge the martyrs. And I believe we talked about the appointed time in Romans 8. We did that. And I think we just started to get into chapter 13.
Well, we said we were going to get into it.
Yes.
Tonight.
Yes. So did you want to start there?
Or do you absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I mean, Romans 13, 11 and following. And now doing this or knowing this, depending on which translation you do, it is high time to awake out of sleep. It is the hour to awake out of sleep. The night is far spent. The day has drawn near. I believe the word there, if I'm not mistaken, I'd have to grab my lexicon. I did not do that. So let me.
Well, you know what, while you're doing that, what I love about this passage is that I believe Paul is tracking on two different versions of the Septuagint. In Daniel 12:4, one Septuagint version says it's the hour of the end.
Yes.
All right, which Jesus will track on in John 4 and John 5. The hour is coming and now is. That's a direct reference back to Daniel 12:4 in the Septuagint.
Yes.
G.K. Beale develops that wonderfully in his book, The New Testament Biblical Theology. I think that's what that was in. But so now you have Paul tracking on that version, the hour, but he's also tracking on another Septuagint version of Daniel 12:4, which uses kairos, the appointed time. So he's kind of bringing in both of the concepts there.
And he's doing it for emphasis sake. I mean, he's just heaping up the evidence, really, so that anybody that was astute, anybody that's tracking with him, is going to see this train and this train converging. And I was starting to say just a moment ago there, so he says, knowing this, or knowing the time, the kairos, that the hour, the hora, has come for you to wake from sleep, for salvation is nearer. That is from the Greek word engouteron.
Oh, okay. Is that related to engos?
That is precisely. It's a derivative of engos. So now he is saying that which was once far off has drawn nearer. And, you know, a lot of my all-millennial friends and brethren and what have you, well, of course, it had been, 30, 40 years since Pentecost.
And it's still nearing, Don. It's just a really long hour that we're in here.
It's the longest hour in the history of the world. But that's what you have to do in order to avoid the linguistics.
Mm-hmm.
The hour is always here. The hour is always growing nearer.
But
You
Don,
know,
doesn't Deuteronomy 32:35, not only does it use kairos, it uses when the appointed time comes, it will be near. And I'm pretty sure probably the Hebrew equivalent of near there is the Greek equivalent to near here. I
yes,
would guess. But
yes,
so Paul's got Deuteronomy 32 all in his head, and Daniel 12,
yes,
or
and Daniel 7.
yeah, and
But
Daniel 12,
and
3,
Daniel 12.
waking
You
up.
know, they let's see how I can put this. The ancient Jewish mind was so saturated with scripture
Mhm.
when they thought of all of these connections, these connecting of the dots, they weren't thinking like we might do today of, pardon me, just one or two texts. They were literally immersed in prophetic text after prophetic text after prophetic text. They could reach out and grab, as it were, any number of them and apply little bitty snippets. um, Sometimes it's called epistash. That is, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little snippet here, a little bit snippet there, in order to formulate the entire statement. And that it's simply wrong for us as modern exegetes to say, oh well, he's drawing upon one passage. No. He is drawing upon one and two and three and four. He's just piling them up. And to the ancient reader, that would be more than apparent. It would not be a mystery to them about, oh, gee, I wonder what text Paul might have in mind. And it would be appropriate to say he had this one and this one and this one and this one, because these are echoes of all of these texts. Now, look at this. When he says, it is the hour for you to wake from sleep. Well, Mike, as you well know, in the ancient Hebraic way of thinking, sleep is a euphemism for what?
Death. And I was just reading Ephesians 5, and I was reading Isaiah 59 and Isaiah 60 in my daily, yearly Bible reading. And Ephesians 5, I mean, the light has come.
Ephesians 5:14.
It's time to wake out of sleep.
Awake, thou that sleepest, arise from the dead.
Yeah. So righteousness, light, and resurrection life are all synonymous. And death, spiritual death, um, and being in your sin are synonymous as well.
That's exactly right. And I was, of course, as you know, I am in multiple YouTube and Facebook debates every day. I'm just, I spend a couple of hours every single morning, basically, uh, trying to respond. I like to correspond. I like to engage in discussion when people are decorous, respectful, collegial, and what have you. And one fellow this last week, he got on and called me a damnable heretic and this and that and the other. And I said, well, let's put a stop to this right here.
Right. Or you can go to another page.
I said, you're not going to come on my blog and use this kind of language. If you cannot act as a Christian gentleman with decorum and respect, guess what? You're going to be gone. So I said, if you do it again, I won't ask. You'll just simply be gone.
Right.
Well, he came back and he said, and he never apologized. He said, well, I wasn't intending to convey hatred. I don't hate you. You're just a false teacher. You're walking that real thin line here.
Yeah.
You know, but he's obviously a dispensationalist, and he has never ever encountered
Right.
proper hermeneutic. He has never encountered at all audience relevance. He just simply doesn't understand. I suspect he'd probably be a really nice guy in person, but he's gotten all riled up, unwilling to think outside of his box. But anyway, the point being, we have all of these terms. what did Daniel say? Many of those who sleep, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise. Everyone acknowledges this is a resurrection text. Whatever form of the resurrection you'd like to talk about, you know, a growing number of people are recognizing it's not literal physical resurrection. By the way, it's even interesting to me that John Collins, in his commentary on Daniel, acknowledges that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is probably not talking about biological death.
If it's not, then how can we say that the New Testament is a failure when it comes to the resurrection promises?
Yeah, really good question.
Yeah, that might be a good question for your liberal opponent there.
Yeah,
for sure. But but who were asleep? Who were still in death? Those who had died under the law, under the old covenant, they were not perfected according to Hebrews. All right, chapter 11 there, 39, 40, I believe.
Yes.
They were not perfected yet. So the biologically dead ones, whose spirit or soul, whether I'm not a soul sleep guy or annihilationist, that's just my view. It doesn't really matter though, because in AD 70, they are raised. They are no longer in death.
Right.
They, with the living, would be changed and be brought into God's kingdom and inherit eternal life. But as far as what Don's saying, yeah, most of this is a corporate covenantal resurrection, which Ken Gentry acknowledges, James Jordan acknowledges, Gary DeMar acknowledges. And as you pointed out, maybe we can talk on this a little bit. You were looking at Gentry's commentary on the book of Revelation, and he has not only has he surrendered Daniel 12 to AD 70, but he's surrendered what passage? Isaiah 26?
Isaiah chapter 26. Awake, awake, thou that sleep in the dust, arise. Isaiah chapter 26, 19 and following, which in his previous commentary, in his little book, The Greatness of the Great Commission, which I think had a date of 1999, if memory serves me correctly. But if anybody wants the specific reference, I'll be more than happy to provide it. But he said the only thing that goes into the dust is the human body to decay. So that was his position in The Greatness of the Great Commission. Now, in his 2024 commentary on Revelation, he says it's corporate resurrection that occurred in AD 70. Yeah, he keeps taking one little step after another toward the full preterist view.
And folks, the New Testament isn't coming up with something new. Paul said that he only taught that which could be found in the law and the prophets. Jesus said he came to fulfill the law and the prophets. They're not making up a different resurrection concept than that which is found in the Old Testament. So if we have Gentry surrendering Daniel 12, and we have Gentry surrendering Isaiah 26, there's really only two left. Isaiah 25, 6 through 9, when death would be swallowed up. But that is connected to the wedding feast, which Gentry says took place in AD 70.
In Matthew chapter 8, verse 11. Absolutely. Done deal.
10 through 12 there. Absolutely. And Revelation 19 through 21. So if the wedding and the wedding feast was fulfilled, and Gentry doesn't want to talk about what Old Testament passage that is fulfilling, a good all-millennialist does. But that's the wedding feast, and the wedding feast is inseparably connected to death being swallowed up, which Paul cites in 1 Corinthians 15. So we can even take that one away, and it really only leaves, I mean, he likes, I guess, Job, but Job, everyone recognizes, the scholars recognize, that is your weakest.
Oh, yeah.
If you're going to try and defend a physical, biological resurrection at the end of time, that is your weakest one. And Don, that is really what the partial preterists are left with at this point.
Well, I'm assuming I'm going to have to assume this. I haven't gotten to the point in his commentary on Revelation yet. And I do not remember what he had to say, to be honest about it, in his He Shall Have Dominion. I'll have to look that up. about what he says about Hosea 13:14. But if he's going to hang on to Isaiah 25, he's got to hang on to Hosea 13:14 because they're both quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:55 and 56 as the two Old Testament passages for the resurrection. Now, here's what's interesting, and I did this prior to my debate with Chris Deut earlier this year. I asked him in written questions, is the death and the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 the same death and resurrection found and predicted in Hosea chapter 13? And he wrote back and he said, yes, they are. Same death to be overcome, same resurrection to overcome that death. Well, okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. Debate's over for all practical purposes' sake. And here's the reason why, folks. And I pointed it out time after time after time in my debate with Chris Deut. He could not answer it. He tried really, really hard to deny that he had actually said it, but he did. I've got the paperwork to prove it. I got the receipts, as the saying goes today. So here was the argument that I put up in a chart. The resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 is the same death and the same resurrection foretold by Hosea chapter 13. But the death of Hosea 13 is not biological death. It is sin death, alienation, separation from God. Hosea 13. When Ephraim sinned, when Israel sinned, he died. Yet he kept on sinning more and more. Pretty sure that's not biological death. Verse 14 is the resurrection to overcome that death. So, once again, the death to be overcome through the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, is the death and the same resurrection foretold by Hosea 13. But the death of Hosea 13 was spiritual death, alienation from God, not physical death. Therefore, the death to be overcome at the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, was not biological death, but it was alienation from God. Chris Deut literally, pardon me, had no answer whatsoever for that.
No.
He wanted to talk about, well, the body this and the body that and blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you identify the body in 1 Corinthians 15. It's still the death. Number one, it's the death of Adam that entered through Adam's sin. But number two, it's the death of Hosea, which you just had to admit it. It is not physical death. So it's not the biological death of a physical human body.
No,
it's a different body.
And Paul is tracking still on Hosea when he's using the seed analogy, because that goes back to what Hosea 2 and 3, where he's divorcing the 10 northern tribes and he's planting them as a seed outside the land of Israel. And so that seed was still in Adam, was still under the Mosaic body, and it was in the process of dying. Mm-hmm. We have the present passive indicative. It was in the process of being sown, and it was dying, but at the same time, it was rising to be a spiritual body, a new covenant glorified body. And that's really what's going on in 1 Corinthians. I think you've written an article on that, and the inclusio, between Hosea 6 to 13.
Hosea chapter 6 specifically, and Hosea chapter 13, but it actually reaches back to chapter 2.
Yeah, with the seed being sown. Yeah.
With the seed being sown. I will sow you to myself in the earth. I will sow you unto me in righteousness. And of course, again, Paul picks up on that seed analogy. And this is a great example to me, Mike, of how biblical scholars, some of which are so eager to find something. I don't know if it was on last week's show. I don't remember which one I've talked about this about. I've got an article in my files that I found a year or so ago on this scholar was trying to draw a direct correlation between the Platonic idea of, quote, death and resurrection, unquote, and Paul's resurrection doctrine in 1 Corinthians 15. Well, the vast majority of scholars would reject that hypothesis. Paul is not a Platonist. He is just, he's just not following Plato. But what is missing in this, what is missing in so many, is that Paul is drawing directly from the Tanakh. He's drawing directly from Hosea. Matter of fact, most scholars that I'm aware of today, most theologians, say Paul's drawing on Daniel 12. Paul's drawing on Ezekiel chapter 37.
Mm.
Paul's drawing on Isaiah 25. Paul is drawing on Hosea chapter 13. And he's undoubtedly drawing on Psalms 110 because he quotes it verbatim. So there are 5 major Old Testament prophecies that Paul is drawing on to develop his theology of Christ, exalted as King of Kings, enthroned in the heavens, as the first fruits of the resurrection.
And Isaiah, I'm sorry, yeah, Isaiah 27, 12 and 13, probably.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's where he gets his trumpet imagery.
Exactly.
That's the sounding of the great trumpet of Isaiah 27, 12, and 13. So there's this great puzzle of how scholars can, they say, oh, well, yeah, Paul echoes this Old Testament text and that Old Testament text. But, pardon me, but really and truly, Paul's following good Grecian thought. Plato. No, he's not. My goodness gracious.
I teach no other
no
thing
other thing
except the hope of Israel, that which is found in the law and the prophets. He couldn't be any clearer. But that's how desperate people get in 1 Corinthians 15. They've got to make Paul, following Plato or, all this, that, and the other, instead of just the Old Testament scriptures, which Richard Hayes makes it clear that, they're just not consistent. Well, Don, let's talk about this real quick. Since we're on the issue of Gentry. So he surrendered Daniel 12. He surrendered Isaiah 26, but Isaiah 26 is in the context of Isaiah 25 and Isaiah 27. They're all 3 of those chapters are resurrection.
They're sandwiched.
They're inseparably connected. So Gentry is ripping Isaiah 26 out of its context. He's not acknowledging that the time of the wedding feast is the time when death is swallowed up, which is a fulfillment of 1 Corinthians 15. And now let's go ahead and develop just a little bit, since we're on this rabbit hole. I've been thinking about it ever since you sent me and Robert that. So Isaiah 27, 12 and 13, of course, we have to back up to verse 9. But when Israel, the great city, the fortified city, is judged, and Jerusalem becomes a heap and the altars become like chalk stone, that is when the forgiveness of sin comes. But it comes when the trumpet sounds and the eschatological gathering takes place, which Jesus quotes in Matthew 24:31. And of course, Paul is tracking on, just as you pointed out, in 1 Corinthians 15. So once again, poor Gentry, cherry picking and just not connecting these dots. I'm wondering why, if that's why he just never debates us.
I suspect, and I have said this before, and you've challenged him to debate you. He's been challenged not only by me personally, but other people as well, people that are close to him. I suspect, I hope this is not an exaggeration, I suspect Ken has been challenged to debate me no less than 15 or 20 times. And the last time I challenged him, he wrote me back, actually, it was kind of a funny note. He said, well, Don, I'll give you this. You are at least persistent.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke with him.
Absolutely.
You shared a platform with him on the Millennium with G.K. Beale,
yes.
At Criswell, at the Criswell conference. And I mean, he's read your stuff.
Oh, believe you me, he has read my stuff.
Obviously, he's read my stuff.
Yes.
Direct responses to his books, and he knows it. It's just, it comes back to what Darren said in his interview with Gary, and that is Gentry feels like he's this ivory tower scholar that just is immune to any questions.
Yeah, I think
and
that's it.
He doesn't have to. He just has to wave his hand, do little pot shots, little one-sided drive-by hit shots at preterism, and that's all he can handle. He can't handle anything else. He can't be cross-examined. He can't be questioned, and that's unfortunate. And I think over time, I don't care how many books he publishes, over time, that is going to be something that communicates something really loud to most people.
I think you're right on that. And I have to say this from a personal perspective. This is troubling to me, and it's very telling, Mike. in his humongous 2-volume set on Revelation. And in none of his earlier commentaries do I remember him quoting you,
Yeah.
and he does not quote me. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. There are some articles that he has written in which he gives a sentence or two taken directly from one of my books, and he just scoffs at the idea. Doesn't tell everybody where he's quoting from. He just simply scoffs at it. I really believe there are two things at work, and I hope this doesn't sound judgmental. I like Ken. He's a really nice guy to be around, very friendly, very cordial. But I think there are two things at work here. Number one, he doesn't want everyone to know that he's reading us so that they would think, well, if you're reading them, maybe you ought to answer them.
Right.
Secondly, he doesn't want to give us the visibility.
No, he doesn't.
Because number one, he knows that you and I quote him extensively in our writings, and we expose his total inconsistency. I mean, from page to page of his own books. And we expose his illogic. We expose his hermeneutic. We actually show that his hermeneutic is very often really, really good, except that he abandons it
Right.
in the key eschatological text. And so, you know, in a book the size of what he has done in this 2-volume set, going all over, and he wrote this on the divorce of Israel. Well, you know, Mike, I've had a little bit to say about the divorce and remarriage of Israel. I had my own tome of over 450 pages, not a word. And my book came out a long time before his book came out, and he knows my book.
And you know that he wants to be a scholar. He wants to be considered a scholar. And so he's citing everybody and their grandma in these 2 volumes, but somehow
we get left out.
Won't reference House Divided and won't reference any of your material. That shows that his position is coming from weakness and not strength at all. Interesting, in my interview in my show with Gary DeMar, this kind of came up, and he said, Mike, I haven't made a career of attacking full preterism.
Right.
I haven't made a career of defending my mentor Bonson. I'm not interested in leaving a legacy. He said, I think Ken has painted himself into a corner because of all the things over the years he has said about full preterism.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I don't do that. I'm a student. I'm open, and I haven't made a career out of attacking you guys. And that, I think, is one of the major problems with Ken's position right now. And I couldn't help but agree.
I think he's spot on. I really do. There's a scholar in the Churches of Christ by the name of Jim McGuigan, very, very brilliant guy, very, very highly educated. He's written a few books, not a lot of them.
I heard him. I refuted that little thin one of his, I think.
Okay, yeah. Jim McGuigan saw a train coming a long time ago. He debated Max King, and Max King just turned him every way but loose. And interestingly enough, and this shows you what kind of a guy Jim McGuigan was, and I've had the pleasure of talking to him on a couple of different occasions. Super nice guy. But after he debated Max King, a couple of years after that, he wrote another little book about AD 70. And in the foreword, he apologized to Max King for the way he conducted himself. He said, I was wrong. I have repented. He said, as I've gone back and I've read the transcripts of that debate, I've listened to the audio. He said, not audio, it was written debate. But he said, as I've read the manuscripts, he said, I've literally been ashamed at my lack of Christian decorum. He said, Max King is my brother in Christ. I disagree with him. But he said, I did not treat him as a brother. And so he said, I want the reader of this book to know that I'm officially apologizing to Max King. Well, here is this guy who was magnanimous in an awful lot of ways, and I've completely forgotten what I was going to cite him on. Where was I, Mike?
Well, we were talking about how Gary was discussing how Ken has made it
Oh,
his
yes, I know
career.
exactly where
He's
I know
made it his
exactly where I was going.
career attacking.
Yes. So Jim McGuigan, I heard him say this in a speech. He said the problem with writing books is that after you write it, you may learn that you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And unless you're willing to go back and make the corrections, that is a constant testimony of the fact that you were wrong. Well, guess what? In my very first book, The Late Great Planet Earth, I made a comment on Romans chapter 7, verse 4. I claimed that Paul very clearly said the law had died. Well, it says no such thing. But my tradition was so strong that when I was writing, that's what I thought the text actually said. I wasn't being dishonest.
Right.
But as I went back later, after I'd done more study, I was reading that statement in my book and I'm going, oh, no, Don, you big dummy, that's not what Paul said. And so in my book on the elements shall melt with fervent heat, I made a point of correcting that. I felt I owed it to my audience. Well, Jim McGuigan was right. The problem that we have, my goodness, oh well. The problem that we have is, at least theoretically, Mike, and I know this is the case with you, and I absolutely know it's the case with me, the more we study, the more insight we have into the things that we've written about before. We can always go back and add to it. We can always go back and edit it. We can always go back and improve it, at least theoretically. Certainly the way I feel about an awful lot of things. Somebody asked me just the other day if I was going to go back and revise my book on Into All the World Then Comes the End. I said, I probably won't live long enough to do that. Do I have more that I want to add to it? About that much,
Right.
But at this particular point, no, I don't have any plans to do that. And again, not because I haven't learned more from the time that I wrote that. I have. It's just that it doesn't allow, the nature of a book does not allow us to instantly correct the things that we think that we need to correct.
But when it comes to Gentry, it is so telling on the things that he has corrected himself. And that was another issue that came up in my interview with Gary. And that is, he pointed out how Ken has changed his position on the parousia in Matthew 24:27.
Yes.
To probably try and harmonize that a little bit better with 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, I'm guessing. But Gary's just like, Matthew 24:34 just destroys that. And then his change on mellow, which in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 19, gives you the outline of it, the things in the past, the present things, he was in the tribulation, and the things that are about to be fulfilled, which would be the end of the millennium. And I think he saw the train coming there. And of course, mellow in Romans 8 and mellow in Acts 24:15. So he makes changes, but he makes them to cover his booty. But then he'll make a change on Daniel 12, which digs himself into a corner. So he digs himself in a corner in this change, but then he tries to avoid the trend coming, so he makes other changes. And it's a shell game instead of just being consistent in your exegesis. Because here's the thing, Daniel 12:7 says all these things will be fulfilled.
Yeah.
The power of the people is completely shattered. So he is saying, I have to take the tribulation and the resurrection as all being fulfilled together, because he says all these things, right?
Yeah.
But then now he's fudging on Matthew 24:34, which he used to understand, okay, all these things are going to be fulfilled in this generation. That would include the coming of Christ, as I believe, as the sunshine coming from the east and the west. But now he's fudged on that. What else is he going to fudge on?
Well, that will remain to be seen. And another element of this is in one of his books. I've forgotten exactly the name of it at the moment. I've got it. I wrote about it in We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, in which I chronicle some of his changes. But what's interesting here is that he actually castigated some, I believe it was John Walford, if memory serves me correctly, for making a change from this book to that book without telling anyone that he was changing, that he had changed his position. And then I documented where he had changed massively, but hadn't told anyone. He just simply made the change. So if Walford was disingenuous for not telling everyone that he had changed his position, then what does that make Kenneth Gentry?
Right.
We'll leave everybody up to make his own decision. Well, anyway.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes, and I think we did a pretty good job there on Romans 13 and kind of segueing into some of the inconsistencies of Ken on these Old Testament texts and not really dealing with Kairos. But 1 Corinthians 7:29, we can briefly get into that. Again, Paul says that the appointed time was short and that Israel's Old Covenant world was passing away. Where is he getting this if he's not getting it from Deuteronomy 32:35, Septuagint, Daniel 9:26-27, Daniel 12:4, again, Septuagint, Isaiah 60:22, Septuagint, Isaiah 49:8, Septuagint. So clearly, Paul he can't be mistaken. He's under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
He's telling you that he is living in the perverse and crooked generation, the last days generation, and that the appointed time had come. That's why the time was short and near. There is such an incredible context to support and talk about the time text, whether it's the covenantal structure or now the appointed time. I mean, those two things and a specific generation. I mean, you put those three things together and you just can't water down the time statements anymore. It just makes them pop and come alive.
It really does. And I appreciate what Thomas I said on one occasion. He actually wrote it. He said, there is a sense of imminence found in the New Testament writing concerning the arrival of the kingdom, judgment, et cetera, that is not found anywhere in the Old Testament. Well, hello.
Yeah, he just got ran over by a train.
He just got ran over completely. He gave up everything, basically. Okay, if that sense of imminence is objective, and it has to be objective, or else it wouldn't be more than the Old Testament.
Right.
If the so-called imminence is purely subjective and it has nothing to do with time, it has to do with spatiality, et cetera, then it's not imminence. So here is Thomas Ice, who wants to tell us, oh, well, one day is with the Lord 1,000 years and all this kind of stuff. And yet he turns around and says there is this sense of imminence in the New Testament scriptures, in the message of the Gospels, that is not found anywhere in the Old Testament. And why is that? Well, it's what Mike and I have been trying to emphasize on this program as we continue to study Kairos, as it is used in Deuteronomy 32 about Israel's last time, Israel's last days, her last end. Okay. And that was to be the Kairos, her appointed time. The rest of the Old Testament picks up on it, and they foretell the coming time, the coming Kairos, over and over and over. And they speak of such terms as in the last days, or it shall come to pass in the latter times, and what have you. But they're always projecting themselves into the future. And I love Joel chapter 2. It shall come to pass in the last days, the Spirit shall be poured out upon all flesh, et cetera, et cetera. Then he tells us, after he talks about, your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, so there shall be darkness and blackness of smoke before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And then you have the great and terrible day of the Lord. Okay. Then he says, chapter 3, verse 1, and in those days and at that time, the Lord shall gather all nations to judgment. Okay, here we have the last days, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, the miraculous gifts of the Spirit during those last days, and the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. So you have the last days period of time, and you have the consummative day of the Lord. And then he picks up on it. And folks, there is no, I know you know this, but let's be reminded of it. There is no chapter division there. In those days, that's the last days that he's just mentioned. And at that time, which is the day of the Lord, I will gather all nations to judgment. This is Matthew 24 and 25. This is Matthew 24:31, the great gathering at the sound of the great trumpet. It's Matthew chapter 25:31, the coming of the Son of Man in his glory. Then shall he sit on the throne of his glory, and all nations shall be gathered before him. That's Joel chapter 3. Well, guess
Revelation
what?
20.
I'm sorry?
Revelation 20.
Absolutely. And then you have in Joel chapter 3 and verse 14, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord is very near in the valley of Jehoshaphat. And some former preterists, they say, oh, well, see, there's the day of the Lord. It was at hand. And yet Joel was written 800 years before the first century. Well, that's overlooking and denying what I call projected imminence. Joel is being projected into what? Into the last days, into that period of time immediately before the day of the Lord, and says, in those last days, the day of the Lord is near. When the last days would arrive, the day of the Lord would be at hand. Well, that's Isaiah 60:22. That's Deuteronomy 4. That's Deuteronomy 32. That in its own time, at that time, it would be near. Not near when Moses wrote. It would be near in the last days. So you have the New Testament writers saying what? Oh, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel, saying it shall come to pass in the last days. Oh, what was happening there that day was what Joel predicted. They were living in the last days. And so Peter said, save yourselves from this crooked and perverse generation, a direct citation of Deuteronomy 32, verse 5.
Yep.
Talk about tying the dots together, folks. And it raises all of these time statements up to a different level if we are not so bound up by the creeds and by tradition and the fear of being put out of the synagogue. They are absolutely undeniable. And they point out to us that first century generation was the appointed time.
Amen.
We're out of time. Yeah.
There's no way to get around it. And I'll just end on the inconsistency of Thomas Ice. The other glaring one was when he admits in Matthew 23, this generation refers to Jesus's contemporary generation, but when Jesus uses this generation in Matthew 24, it's a totally different one. It's one.
Oh, yeah, it's prophetic in Matthew 24, and it's not prophetic in Matthew 23.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. A lot of inconsistencies, a lot of gymnastics, folks, for the futurists and even the liberals that we started the show with. Look at all the eisegetical gymnastics and presuppositions these folks have to read into the text, all the inconsistencies that are there just to avoid the simple truth that Jesus' second coming actually was fulfilled when he said, the appointed time and in his generation. Man. Thanks for joining us. Excuse me. Yeah, and we'll see you next week. Oh, Don, why don't you go ahead and announce that the debate, I believe, has been canceled, correct?
No. The debate has not been canceled. My flight to North Carolina is what has been canceled.
Is it going to be an internet?
Yes, it will be. It will be, and that's 1 week from tomorrow, October the 12th, 2024, of course. It will be on Myth Vision, MYTH Vision.com. And it will be carried on YouTube. It will be carried on Facebook. It should be carried live on on my Facebook feed. I don't know. I'm going to see try to get Alan Morton, my fantastic webmaster, to
He's
make
awesome.
sure that it's done that way. But folks, you don't want to miss this. It really is. It's generating an awful lot of interest. I will tell you that it really, honestly is. And so I'm super excited about this. I've said this before. I've debated several PhDs, none with quite the prominence that Dr. Carrier has. And so he's a brilliant guy in a lot of ways.
Yes.
He is not a theologian. That's all I'll say.
Or he's a very inconsistent one when it comes to apocalyptic language. And that's going to be the train that's going to hit him. And a lot of people are paying attention to this debate because, guys, full preterism is the only Christian position that has an answer to the skeptics. Partial preterism does not. Just like partial preterism does not have the answer to the charismata and when the gifts ended and why. So that's why the interest. Full preterism is gaining steam, and we're running over people left and right, all to the glory of God.
Amen.
They correct their position and exposing that darkness.
Amen.
All right, Don. Well, Lord
All
bless
right.
you, and we'll see you next week, sir.
Yes, sir. Amen.
All right.